My name is Jason, and it happened during quarantine, 2 months after I finished year 11. Everything seemed to slow to an aching halt due to the coronavirus pandemic. I wasted away in my confined bedroom as the internet swallowed up my whole life. My hobby was rather erratic, to say the least. Instead of gaming online or productively searching through articles, I somehow ended up getting more and more into the deep, dark web. Human sacrifices, satanic rituals, and things that were horribly indescribable. I'd spend days and nights completely fixated to my screen. Sometimes I'd go days without sleeping. My concept of time had completely gone. One day I stumbled upon a shady website asking me for my email address. It promised me that I would have the sweetest dreams. Now most people would think straight, but being my stupid self, I signed up. A week after this occurrence, my parents were called away to London for a business meeting. They were having a frustrating time with their business, so it was pretty urgent. The moment I heard the car leave the driveway, I booted up my PC, eager to surf the dark web again, only to be peppered with notifications. My heart started to beat like a drum. Laying before me were 2 emails. I opened up the first. It only included a link to a Facebook page, though the sender, oddly enough, didn't have a username or a picture. I obliged and clicked the link. Plastered on every feed was my face. Some of them had been twisted and contorted into horrific shapes. For a while I just sat there. Cold sweat dripped down my forehead. I tried to laugh it off. It had to be my friends trolling me, right? But then again, I barely had any. I opened the second message. I felt just about ready to hurl as flashing lights and cheap animations flooded my screen, combining into a nauseating mix. The joke was going way too far now. I clicked the X button, but it simply wouldn't go. "God damn it!" I shouted. I slammed my desk, and suddenly the screen shut off. I was drowned in complete darkness. The clock read 12:08, and I once again just sat. Any attempt to turn the computer back on failed. I shook it off and went inside my duvet, trying to forget about what happened. A thud. I thought it came from my window, but no, this wasn't from my window. No, these were heavy footsteps, making their way through the house and onto the stairs. I panicked and slammed my door shut. I didn't know what to do as I was home alone, and it didn't make things better that we live in an isolated part of town. Who the hell was it, and what the hell did they want? Was it the guy who sent me the email? At this point, I was literally pissing my pants. "I'm calling the police, get the hell away from me," I cried. No answer. "I'm warning you." I turned to my phone. My heart sank as the icon read, "No service." The footsteps continued. Every step taken filled me with utter dread. The feet made their way into the hallway. I desperately searched around for something to defend myself with, and tears started to stream down my face. "Get the hell away from me." I turned on the computer. At the sound of the startup, the footsteps ceased right in front of the door. As I took a shallow breath, a large axe smashed a hole through the door. I screamed in terror as the door came crashing down. A figure shrouded in a trench coat, slick with blood and gore, towered before me. But what I saw next is something that will always haunt me till the day I die. All over his face were deep open cut wounds, filled with worms and maggots, eating through his flesh. The man's large hand outstretched in front of my face, and before I knew it, I blacked out. I jerked awake in a cold sweat and looked around, realizing that it was just a dream. I turned to my clock, just as the time went from 12:07 to 12:08. Then I heard the heavy footsteps again. Aohara was a relatively small town, so seeing all the farmers leave for their fields at 6 in the morning was a new sight to me. I had recently completed my teaching course at Tokyo, and settling into this rural town took more than a little effort. For the first month, I tried finding a job in the nearby cities. I didn't want to stay here for any longer than I needed to. Entire nights were spent on my computer, refreshing pages and looking through websites. But alas, there were no vacancies. I even considered taking on tutoring lessons at one point. After another unsuccessful day, I tucked myself to bed, resting uneasy. The next morning, my letterbox snapped. I groggily made my way downstairs, the morning light barely escaping the blinds. To my surprise, the letter wasn't a bill, but an invitation. "Dear Hakashi," it read, "we understand that you're struggling to find a job. Enclosed are the directions to Aohara High School. We hope you arrive in safe health." There was no sender. I thought for a while. There was no high school in Aohara, and I was pretty damn sure about that. I reread the letter. There was no mistaking it. It was my first offer. There was no way I could turn it down. I needed to get there before someone else did. A few hours later, I started up my car and made my way to the school. The instructions were pretty confusing, so I had to stop every now and then, so much so that it was getting late. The moonlight dulled and fog crept its way into the air. "Go through the tunnel," it read. Sure enough, there was one up ahead, but as my car crossed its boundaries, the front lights flickered off. I dismissed it and continued driving. At the end of the tunnel, I pulled up to what looked like any other ordinary high school. I prayed that there was still someone around as I got out of the car. Some of the rooms still had their lights on, so I took this as a good sign. The first thing I noticed was just how quiet it was. Granted, it was nighttime, but something didn't seem right. As I made my way into the front office, I was greeted by a young woman, admittedly pretty, so I felt a bit shy. But it eased me knowing that the school wasn't as abandoned as it looked. Hi, I'm Hakashi. I got a letter. Before I could even finish my sentence, she stood up and began walking, leaving the office. I shook it off and followed her. "Could I get your name?" No answer. She just kept walking stiffly, and on her face there was a creepy smile. We made our way down corridors. The classroom doors shut. Some of them had the lights on, and I tried peering into them to no avail. I assumed this was just procedure, and I followed on. Eventually, we stopped before what I assumed was the principal's office. The woman knocked twice and quickly left. I was all alone before the mahogany door. A few seconds passed, the doorknob turned, and opened up into a room sparsely decorated. A single table and 2 chairs, that was it, and seated across from me was a well-built man in a suit that looked like it barely fit. He just smiled. I took the other seat and extended my hand. He just looked at it and back at me again. Awkwardly, we stood like that for a while. I should have just ran at that point, but somewhere inside my head, I debated on whether this was a test, or if I was in some sort of delirious dream world. Just as I retracted my hand, the principal shuffled with something under the table, and placed a sheet of paper and pen on the surface. I read it, wary all the while of his eyes boring into me. They were completely lifeless. There was no text on the paper, just a single line. I looked at the principal for help. Nothing. I swallowed and picked up the pen and signed the paper. As I did, I noticed that in the corner of the room, a black taint began, as if it was singed, as if it was burning. The door behind me creaked open. I stood up immediately. I needed to get out. Looking behind one more time, the principal just stared with that goddamn grin. The black taint was growing quickly, so I rushed out as fast as I could. I passed through the corridors again, but I needed to check one thing. I stopped before a classroom and opened the sliding door. Students sat at their desks, with a teacher at the front. Not one looked at me. They sat frozen, glued to their faces. A smile. A lifeless, emotionless smile. There was no time. I ran the last way to my car, without looking at the receptionist. The car took a long time to start, and when it did, I spent no time backing out. I took one last glance behind me. The principal and what seemed like all the students were waving and smiling at me. The school was on fire, the embers turning the sky into an ashen blanket. I was absolutely horrified, and to this day I still regret looking back. I put my foot to the pedal and cleared the tunnel in no time. I stopped by the police station and staggered in. The attendants, unused to activities so late at night, helped me up. The school, on fire, I gasped. At this, they exchanged looks. Where? One asked. The one near the tunnel, I replied. They looked at each other again. That school doesn't exist anymore. It closed decades ago, the other said. It can't be, I saw it. The principal went mad and set fire to the whole school, killing everyone in the building. It's been closed for a long time. Despite my pleas, they took me home where I could barely sleep. In the morning, I received another letter. It simply read, "We hope to see you soon." I've stopped looking for a teaching job since and promised myself that I would never go back to that place. But I still receive letters every day asking me to come back. I've burnt them all, but nothing works. I think I see my rooms turning blacker every day. Actually, on a second thought, I think I might come back.
The scratching noise. Kevin lived in a small apartment downtown. The walls were fairly thin, so he was used to hearing his neighbors sometimes. One night, he heard an unfamiliar sound. It was like a scraping in the walls. He figured it was the new neighbors and gave them a break. The noise went away after a few minutes, and he was able to go to sleep. The next day, he walked past them in the hallway. They had a nice chat. He learned they just finished moving in yesterday, so he was right. They were the cause of the sound. They talked a little more before he had to get to work. Everything went back to normal for about a week. Then, at the same time as before, the sound happened again. It was soft at first, then grew into a repetitive scratching noise. Almost like someone was doing a long, scraping motion against the walls. It was loud enough that it woke him up. He went to bang his fist on the wall to tell whoever it was to stop. Before he could even bring his fist down, the sound disappeared. He flopped his arm down and shrugged it off. In the morning, he went to get dressed but noticed something. His closet door was cracked open. He thought he closed it the night before. Cautiously, he opened it. There was nothing different about it. Everything looked exactly the same. He laughed it off and got dressed. After that, things were normal for 2 weeks. One night, he came home drunk and went straight to bed. He had a dream. It was dark, but he felt hot. There was sweat dripping down his face. His arms and legs felt like they were restrained. He started to panic as the scraping sound returned. It filled his ears until it was the only thing he could hear. Kevin shot out of bed. Sunlight was coming in through the window. He realized it was just a dream and took a shaky breath. Then, he looked over and saw his closet door was wide open. He always closed his closet door and remembered back to the one day where it was slightly open. He let it go at the time because sometimes it just doesn't latch. This time, there was no reason for the door to be open that wide. Then he remembered he was drunk last night, so maybe he opened it and just blacked out. He wasn't wearing any different clothes than the day before, though. He was a little shaken, but decided to forget about it. He got up to close the door and nurse his hangover. 1 month passed before there was another incident. It was pitch black in Kevin's bedroom, and he was dead asleep. The scratching noise started one more time, but it didn't wake him up. It lasted a few minutes and then slowly faded away. Then, the doorknob to his closet twisted open. A thin beam of light shone into his room. It widened as the door opened. A shadow, in the shape of a person, stood centered in the light. Kevin shifted in his sleep. His eyes began to flutter open as the shadow walked towards him. Before he could react, he was hit on the head. The first thing he felt before he even opened his eyes was heat. It was dark, but he could make out vague shapes. It seemed like he was in a very small space. He tried to move, but realized his arms and legs were tied down. Then he heard something. It sounded like someone was walking towards him. Suddenly, a light turned on. It blinded him for a second, even though it was just a small lamp. The first thing he saw was wall slats. He was inside the walls of his apartment building. Something was in his closet. He also noticed strange words and symbols carved all over the walls. Was that the reason for the scratching noise? He squinted at the walls as his eyes adjusted to the light. The shadow stepped out in front of him. It was his new neighbor. Kevin's jaw dropped. He couldn't believe what was going on. The neighbor laughed at his expression. "I'm not who you think I am." Its face began to twist and bend. Its body contorted, changing size and shape. When it stood up straight again, Kevin was looking at himself. "I am a shapeshifter. I ate your neighbor and took their shape. And now you're next." Before he could scream, the shapeshifter gagged him, uttered, "I'll be back," and walked towards the hole in his closet.
My name is Nikki and I'm 19 years old. This past December, I got myself a Christmas temp job working at Amazon, helping with deliveries. It gets pretty busy around that time for deliveries, obviously, because it's Christmas. Right away, I hated the guy I was helping with deliveries. His name was Frank. To describe him, he was a bit overweight, didn't shave well, and his hair was short. I didn't like him because he was very rude and seemed like he was in a bad mood all the time. And I would be in the van with him most of the time making deliveries, and it was very awkward. I tried to make conversation with him, but like I said, he was very rude. And there was no point in trying after about 2 times. I thought about quitting, to be honest, or at least be with a different delivery driver, but I didn't want to cause any trouble. I was a temp after all and needed this job. I thought Frank was really rude and socially awkward and not a nice person to be around, but I never thought he would harm me in any way. One evening after finishing deliveries, we were driving back to the Amazon warehouse, or at least that's where I thought we were going. Frank passed the turn where we always go to the warehouse. As I said before, we didn't really speak, so I wasn't about to question him. He would probably snap at me anyway. After he continued driving, the more obvious it was to me he was taking me to another place, and it wasn't the warehouse. I finally asked Frank where we were going. He didn't snap at me, surprisingly. He just said we needed to run and do a quick errand. I was looking around my surroundings, and I could see that we were around empty fields and abandoned farmhouses. At this point, it was getting dark outside. Frank then pulled up next to a tall, overgrown, and unkempt cornfield. He said to me in a very firm voice to stay exactly where I was. "Don't move." Frank then got out of the car and started walking up into the dirt road, disappearing into the dark of night. 10 minutes went by. I sat in the van by myself in the dark and had no idea where I was. My phone was in the warehouse in the locker, as we weren't allowed to have our phones during work hours, so I couldn't even go on my phone or use it as a light source. I needed to pee and couldn't hold it any longer, so I got out of the van and headed into the cornfield to do my business. After doing so, I started to walk back towards the van. In the near distance of the cornfield, I could see flashlights. 2, in fact. I found that really odd, as the whole area seemed to be abandoned. As I got closer to the van, I could hear a sort of heated argument going on between Frank and another man whose voice I couldn't recognize. I couldn't see him either. I heard the other man say, "Where is she? You said she was in the van." Frank then told the man that she was just in there, and she has to be around here somewhere. The other man said to Frank, "If we don't find her, you're a dead man." That's what those flashlights were. Those men were already out in the cornfield searching for me. I snuck off into the field, walking quickly but as quietly as I could, the whole time crying and thinking I was about to die. After walking far enough, eventually leaving the cornfield, I ran down the side of a long dirt road. I have no idea for how long, but eventually I came across an old diner which was still open, thank God, and the manager called the police for me. After this incident, I quit my job, but this wasn't the end of it. About 2 weeks after quitting my job, I got a call from my boss who employed me. He told me that I was the last one to see Frank, as no one has seen him since. Apparently there were rumors that he owed people money from gambling debts, the people you don't want to be in debt with. As much as I don't like to think about it, I'm pretty sure Frank's way of paying off his debts with those people was to hand me over to those men. And what those men had planned to do with me, I never wanted to imagine.
I bolted to the front desk. I frantically looked for the gun, only to realize it was missing. Without thinking, I ran outside in pure panic, freaking out. With shaking hands, I locked the door behind me, when I heard the shallow breathing again. For a while, I worked as a 911 call operator. My friend Daniel had just finished his police training and said that the police had some vacancies, so it would pay a decent amount. The only catch was that I'd have to take the late night shifts. Being a broke college student, it was fine by me. Besides, job vacancies were becoming quite rare in those days. Training didn't actually take that long. I just needed to be calm and collected. Soon enough, I passed the test with flying colours and got the job immediately. My first week as a 911 call operator was pretty uneventful. In fact, the first week was pretty boring, if anything. Drunk dialers, the odd medical emergency, nothing too serious like murder or shootings. There were a few other college students there, but I never really got along with them, to be honest. I was just there for a quick buck. The second week, though, was a little different. It was only me. Daniel said that they didn't need as many people anymore, and I was the lucky one to stay. Even more nights spent staring at a blank monitor. What a drag. I settled in on a Monday in the third week. The station was basically empty. I poured myself a strong latte and settled in, expecting another uneventful night.
911, what's your emergency?
The line was basically second nature to me by then. I heard nothing on the other end for a while. Then I heard a creepy laugh.
Can I order some pizza?
I sighed and ended the call. Prank callers were always annoying, and I was told to reprimand them, but honestly, for minimum wage, I really couldn't be asked. I sipped my latte and looked around. It was really peaceful. I was always introverted, so this was a dream come true. 911, what's your emergency?
I think someone's following me.
I paused. Daniel?
Mike? Yeah, it's me. I'm off duty. But there's this guy that's been following me for a while now. I've turned around 3 corners and he's still after me. I'm alone, Daniel. You gotta help me.
Where are you?
I'm making my way to the station.
Before I could reply, the call cut off. As the call ended, I ran downstairs. Just in case, I took a gun from below the front desk. I returned to my desk and waited again.
911, what's your emergency?
Hello? I said. The call cut off. Another prank call? Literally the worst time for this. I shook it off and tried to get the worrying thoughts out of my head. I crept downstairs, gun at the ready. Slowly, I creaked the door open. I was relieved to see my friend Daniel in his usual blue hoodie and Nike Air Jordans. He was wearing a face mask, so I didn't really notice anything much. But for some reason, there was something slightly off about him. Putting the gun back underneath the desk, I approached my friend. "You had me worried there," I said. "Nothing bad," he said, pointing a thumb behind. "I think he dipped when he saw me come in." I nodded and made my way back up again. The night shift resumed as usual. An hour had passed and I assumed that Daniel had left. I went downstairs to check. Sure enough, he had left, but for some odd reason, he left the door wide open. I rang Daniel from my personal phone to make sure things were okay. He finally picked up. "Hey man, did you get home safely?"
What are you talking about, Mike? I've been home all day.
My heart skipped a beat. I bolted to the front desk. I frantically looked for the gun, only to realize it was missing. Without thinking, I ran outside in pure panic, freaking out. With shaking hands, I locked the door behind me. When I heard the shallow breathing again, I turned to face him. My suspicions were true. It wasn't Daniel. It was some crazy psycho posing as him. One of his eyes was visibly twitchy, larger than the other. His skin was pale and drenched in sweat. In his hands, there was the gun. "Hey, what the hell's going on?" The last thing I remember were those gunshots and that laugh. I remember waking up at the ER the next morning. The doctor told me I was lucky to be alive. The bullets were barely inches away from my heart. No one knows who that crazy psycho was, or where he went, or what he wanted. Fortunately, Daniel was fine and had never come into contact with the man. But every night, I get nightmares about that crazy psycho and how my lack of wariness could have killed me. My teacher always told me that putting the right pressure on coal would turn them into diamonds. When I told my parents this, they just laughed and told me that it was impossible. I can't tell you the amount of days I'd spend stomping on the coal pieces scattered around my backyard, trying to make those precious diamonds, trying to prove my parents wrong. When Christmas came by though, I no longer had a need for them. My parents would give me toys and games instead, but only on the condition that I had not been a naughty boy. My family was gathered around, me, my sister, and my parents. The gifts were great, a Lego set and an iPad. I could finally play Among Us with my friends. I tore into my stockings, bristling with joy. But to my bittersweet surprise, I found coal. "What's this?" I asked. My dad chuckled and ruffled my hair. "Have you been a naughty boy this year, Chris?" No," I lied. "Then why did Father Christmas get you coal?" my mom replied. I thought for a while and then came up with a solution. "To make diamonds." I scooped up the coal and went outside to stomp on them again. Late at night, when all were asleep, I heard heavy footsteps creaking up the stairs. It couldn't be who I thought it was, could it? I turned my head and tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't resist the temptation to see them. A round man, dressed in festive clothes with a sack over his shoulder, stood at the landing with a large smile. It couldn't have been anyone else but Santa. He noticed me and I shyly waved. He waved me over and knelt down. "Ho ho ho! Whatever are you doing up so late, Chris?" "I knew it was you, Santa, but didn't you come by yesterday?" He giggled quietly and whispered, "Well, yes, but Santa's got another surprise for you, my boy." "So what did I get you this year?" "Transformers, an iPad, and..." I stopped. "And coal. I'm sorry for being a bad boy." Santa stroked his beard. Then he lay a hand on my shoulder. "My dear Chris, have you heard that coal turns into diamonds when they're under the right squeeze?" My eyes lit up and I nodded enthusiastically. "Don't worry, you're still a diamond, my boy. But your parents?" He looked at the door leading to my parents' bedroom. "They're coal, my boy. I think they need to be turned into diamonds." I stood there for a while. My vision was blurring. "Turn them into diamonds, my boy." I turned the handle to my parents' room. They slept quietly, not noticing me. With one pillow, I pressed down hard on my mom's face first. She stopped struggling after a while. My dad was a bit stronger, but Santa was right there to help me, smiling. When all was done, I wondered for a bit. They didn't look much different, but Santa told me that it would take some time. "I think your sister is coal as well, Chris." I nodded. "Don't worry, Santa. I'll make her a diamond." We were young and stupid, and as young and stupid college kids do, we came up with the craziest ideas and events. For our end of semester, we thought about camping out in the nearby forest. Honestly, I still regret going to this day. There were 4 of us: Ben, Amy, Samantha, and me, Kevin. As far as living out in the wild went, we knew next to nothing. People warned us. They told us to take precautions, like first aid packs or radios. One guy even told us to carry a gun. We only took the last piece of advice, and in Ben's words, to hunt us some critters. Aside from that, we each carried our own tent and a lifetime supply of junk food. We didn't tell anybody else where we were going, not even our parents. This was our night out, so no one was going to stop us. At 5 AM, we left. Samantha had stolen her dad's Jeep, so we needed to get away quite fast. Getting to the forest was a lot harder than we thought. The roads were narrow, and despite it being daytime, barely any light could actually get through. After an hour of arguing on where to camp, we settled on a nice spot by the lake. The first few hours were spent on swimming and barbecue. We tried to get a decent fire going, but settled on a small flame, which made us some very undercooked sausages. Swimming was an even worse experience. The water was murky and muddy and smelled awful. So far, the trip wasn't going too well. Amy was feeling sick from the food, but she smiled through it. Samantha wanted to call it quits, but luckily, Ben had the solution. As night fell, the already dark forest had basically become pitch black. We couldn't see even a few meters ahead of us. Ben was holding the pistol that we'd brought along for emergencies. He waved it around, acting like some sort of gangster. He told us we were going hunting. "So what are we hunting then?" I asked.
"Squirrels, bats, anything, I don't know,"
he said dismissively. We went out holding hands so we wouldn't get separated. Ahead, Ben jumped at every sound, pointing his gun recklessly at unseen targets. I asked him if I should hold it instead, but he got angry very quickly.
"What, you think I'm scared?"
"Mate, you're being a twat right now. What if you shoot someone?" He didn't say anything and kept walking. We did this for a while in the pitch black night. When we found nothing else, we retraced our steps, slowly but surely, back to where we pitched our tents. Then we tucked into our sleeping bags for the night. I rolled around trying to find that one comfortable position to sleep in. Even through my sleeping bag, the cold chilled me to the bone. I heard a stumble outside. I left my tent. If I couldn't sleep, I'd rather just talk to someone. "Hey, who is that?" A figure by the lake turned around. I couldn't see who it was, but judging by the position they were in, I thought I had caught Ben in the middle of his business. I laughed and apologized. But Ben didn't say anything back. He just darted towards the tree line, disappearing in moments. I thought nothing more of it. Maybe he was just embarrassed. I went back to my tent, but stopped when I heard feet shuffling again. "Ben, whatever you're trying to do, it's not working. Just stop." The feet stopped. "You couldn't get any sleep, could you?" No response. "Hello?" There was a muffled voice. It sounded like it was trying to scream. Unnerved, I rushed out of my tent and into Ben's tent, ripping open. It was empty. But the gun was there on the floor, so I picked it up. The muffled screams got quieter and quieter. I looked in Amy's and then Samantha's tent, all empty. Then it hit me. They were probably filming some prank for YouTube. Surely. I approached the muffled sounds, laughing all the while. "Alright guys, you got me. Come on, stop it now." Instead of my friends, I saw 3 men, all wearing masks staring at me. White, faceless masks, and behind them, a van. The tires were slick with gore and blood. Before I could even raise my gun, they ran towards me, making no noise whatsoever. I turned and ran and ran and ran. I stopped to catch my breath and heard a twig snap. This time, I wasn't hesitating. I fired into the dark. There was a sickening thud. It was Ben, hung from a tree and blood leaking in a big red spot from where I shot him. Hung around his neck was a sign reading, "Thank you for their meat." I screamed in horror and rushed into Samantha's Jeep. As soon as I got in, I pushed the pedal and left the scene in no time. Tears were streaming down my face in both fear and regret as I drove back home. The next day, I watched the news about how they had found Ben's body in the woods and that Samantha and Amy were never found. Now they're coming for me. I know it. We were young and stupid. I rushed to my uncle's bedroom.
What if I go stronger? What if I get higher? What if I start doing things I know I will?
I am a male, aged 16. Every vacation, we go to Uncle Joe's house and have a great time. But the New Year's Day of 2016 was the worst day of my life. I was 12 at that time, so I looked forward to family gatherings. We went to my uncle's house to celebrate the new year, and we had a blast. We played the usual family games like Uno, Jenga, and Monopoly. But just as the clock struck midnight, I thought I heard a knock. Who the hell would come to visit at 12 a.m.? Being the curious boy I am, I went to the window to see who it was. When I saw them, I almost threw up. It was a crazy looking man with a smile way too large. I was pretty sure that there were slits cut in the corners of his mouth. He started banging the window with his fists. Instinctively, I shot back in fear, with no idea who this man was or what he wanted. Then I heard him yell,
"Let me in. I won't do anything crazy. I just want some blood."
My uncle, who was quite a buff dude, marched to the door and looked through the eye hole. On a close inspection, the guy outside was wearing a torn white shirt and a black pair of pants. Suddenly, the door handle cracked open. My uncle tried to shut the door, but the psychopath at the door had crazy strength and was overpowering him. My parents tried helping him, but it was no use. Things were looking bad. Then the lunatic started thrusting a large knife, which had a strong stench of blood. My uncle inches away from it. In sheer desperation, my uncle shouted,
Call the cops!
I snapped out of my fear and dialed 911. Soon enough, the cops had arrived, but by the time they showed up, it was too late. The man had already run off. They couldn't find a single trace of him. It was about 2 in the morning by then, so we decided to call it a night after the nightmarish ordeal. My parents decided to go home, but I insisted on staying over for the night, for some reason. A few hours later, I was awakened by footsteps. After hearing them come up the stairs, I sat up trembling with fear. Was it the guy who was at the door? I rushed to my uncle's bedroom. It was him, the same guy from before. My uncle was shot in the back and lay struggling, while my aunt was in the corner, in a fetal position, weeping in fear. The man was getting ready, as if to start feasting on my uncle.
"Don't worry, sir. I just want some blood."
The psycho had his back turned and hadn't noticed me, so there was a chance to catch him by surprise. His gun was right there, inches away from me. Slowly, I grabbed it and pulled the trigger on that motherfucker right in the arm. He screeched in pain.
"You little brat!"
Then he ran out like a madman, with his arm flopping to the side. We called the cops and the ambulance. My uncle survived, but now he's paralyzed from the waist down. I just wonder what would have happened to my uncle if I hadn't have insisted on staying at his house. But that was the worst day of my life.